Today I'm going to be painting this little lake scene with some reflections on my iPad using Procreate, and I'll mostly be using the freehand color fill, especially for the early stages, and I'll be blocking in the big shapes and getting a rough idea where everything needs to go. I'm not overly careful where everything lines up, etc. I'm just kind of getting a gist of what it should look like. I'm trying to paint 100 of these landscapes in roughly the same style, and this is number 7, I think. I'm just about to pop up the previous 6 if you're interested in those. I'll put links in the description, so go check them out. But meanwhile, I'll carry on talking about this one. So what I do is I create the big shapes all on each different layer, and using the color fill tool I can do this quickly, a lot more quicker than I can with the brush. And the nice thing about the color fill is it also makes very sharp edges, which I can soften if I want to later on, where it's harder to go the other way around. So the tree is obviously a big shape with lots of detail, and because it's overlapping, I thought I would do that first. Now I'm using the technical pen from Procreate, but the brush doesn't really matter. It's just a hard brush, and almost anything will do. I don't have smoothing on, I don't think, but that kind of helps if you're a bit jittery. It's quite nice in Procreate. It's one of the best for smoothing out lines. I actually have quite shaky hand generally, and to do smooth curves, etc., is very difficult. So Procreate is very cool for that. So I use that quite a lot if I want smooth lines. But for landscapes, it's kind of rare that you need smooth lines anyway. You definitely want variety. So when I'm creating these shapes, that's what I'm looking for. I'm not really copying the reference when I'm trying to make these trees. I'm just trying to make them have a bit of variety and nice negative shapes. So we're on to slightly like part 2, where I take the underlying colors and I put the shadows and highlights on. What I usually do is put a level above the big shape, and then I put on the mode called clip and mask on the layer. That means anything I draw above the layer will just stick to whatever's underneath, so I don't have to worry about sticking into the lines. And here I'm using the smudge tool, which is nice for doing soft edges. It's a little bit messy there, but I'll tidy that up later. It's much easier than using the airbrushes to get the soft lines, because that kind of goes all over the place. So you get a lot more control with the smudge tool. So I use the hard brushes to get the rough shape, and then I'll use the smudge tool to soften the edges. And you be careful with the smudge tool, because it's quite powerful. If you change the opacity to halfway or lower, it is not so powerful. That's the left bar down in the bottom left in Procreate. And so I'm doing roughly the same here all around the picture. I tend not to stay in one area. I want to get a gist of everything that's going on and level the painting up as I go, so I can make sure it's making sense. So one thing I like to do fairly early on is make sure everything sits on the floor. I don't like it when you see things floating. So that's why I do the little shadows under the land, so it looks like it's on the floor. Otherwise you can't really tell what's going on there. So again, working on the other tree, I don't use the color fill tool for little things like this, because it gets a little bit fiddly to do small lines, and it's more difficult than using the technical pen. Again, I'm not watching the reference here. I'm just trying to make nice shapes. Don't try and copy branches and things, because they're too complicated. Just have a look at them and see which direction they roughly go, and try to just make nice shapes, really, and a variety of branch thickness, etc. So I'm just working around the painting, trying to find where the highlights are. I made a mistake there. I didn't have the clipping mask on, so that's what happens without the clipping mask. And it's good to find out where the sun's coming from, In landscapes, it can be quite difficult to tell sometimes because quite often the sun is quite up above everything, kind of direct over what you're painting in the first place. It's generally not to the left or the right, obviously it's kind of in the middle. So and this is why the reference photo helps quite a lot there to get shadows in the right place. Quite difficult to make up, so I do pretty much copy the shadows as they are. If you try and change the light, you can make weird mistakes. I've done plenty of times where I've actually put the shadow on completely the wrong side from where the sun's coming from and didn't even notice. So that happens quite a lot. So for these foliages, I'm not sure that's a word, but for the foliage, I try not to be scared about the detail. Of course, if you look at the foliage, there's a crazy amount of detail. And for my style, I'm not really interested in trying to nail it. You need lots of textured brushes and lots of fiddly little detail here and there, which looks great, obviously. But for my style, I like to do things quickly. So what I generally do is I get in a rough big shape, 2 layers generally, maybe 3. So I'll have the dark and the light. The same concept for the bushes in the back as well. I'll have the dark and the light, and then I'll use an eraser to add texture to it. You could use textured brushes for this. It would probably speed the process up. But I never find any textured brushes I kind of like, and they all start to look like the same pattern if you use the textured brushes, and it kind of looks more like a stamp brush if you're not careful. So I prefer just to do it myself. So what I'll do is I'll take the eraser and make it like the technical pen as well. So it's hard edges. You can change your brush to be, the eraser to be a brush as well, which is pretty cool. So I'll get to that in a second. I'm adding some texture in the background here. You want to be careful about putting too much detail in the background, even if there's lots of detail in your photo, because the camera will pick up crazy detail and you don't want to copy all of it. So this is what I was talking about with the eraser. Basically, I'm just whizzing around trying to remove the edges of anything I have. So with foliage, you don't really have, thick edges. So I'm basically just going around the edges, trying to remove them in a kind of a nice pattern to give the illusion of lots of detail. This only takes a couple of minutes. It can be quite hard on the hand, actually, but like I said, you could use textured brushes, and I'm not against that, but just watch that they don't get a bit samey, and I found they generally do. But I'll play around with textured brushes. Let me know in the comments if you know any good ones for Procreate and may speed up the process. I've got nothing against them. So when it comes to I guess one of the most important things about this painting are the reflections down the bottom. Now, the reflections can be quite difficult, to be honest, sometimes. And what you want to do is not try and worry about what's actually in the reflection exactly. Just try and get some of the colors from the scene into the water and then blur them. So what I mean by that is grab some of the greens from the grass, put it in the water, and blur them out. Make sure your blur goes in the same direction. Usually it can go vertical or it can go horizontal. They both kind of work, but make sure they go in the same direction. It has to be almost perfectly horizontal or vertical. If it starts to go any other direction, it'll look like the water is not on the ground properly. So be very careful. You'll see I'm very careful about going vertical there. So be careful with that, or it'll look like your entire world is tipped, and it'll just, people will see it and it'll look weird. So what the reflection is really doing here is mimicking what's above it. So I'm getting the background trees in there. Now I'm getting the sky where it's the lightest. And I'm using the smudge tool again, really big this time, so it's nice and soft. So that's kind of the bit above the trees, and then you got the foliage, the dark bits of the actual trees. Now you don't have to be completely accurate. You don't really want like a mirror, because that's only when the water is incredibly still, and that doesn't really happen that often. I know, because I try and photograph it when I'm out and it's never still. So don't be overly careful about it. It's just putting the colors into the water and then smudging them. So that's just the big trunk there. It's probably not even lined up correctly, but it doesn't really matter. Is when we glance at it, does it look like reflections? Hopefully you say yes. It could be blurred a little bit more, to be honest. If you don't want to use the smudge tool, or you want to blur it in one go, use the filter menu. Sorry, and use Gaussian blur. I use Gaussian blur quite a lot, and that's also a quick way to smooth things out. And you'll see me using it now and again when I use the color fill tool. I go to Gaussian blur because it'll blur two colors together, and it's a nice easy way to get gradients in Procreate because it still doesn't have a gradient tool. So Gaussian blur does it anyway, so I guess it's quite nice to do as well because you can put lots of colors in there. So you can put reds and blues and greens or whatever, and Gaussian blue, and they'll all kind of mix together nicely. So it's another fast way to do, effects. Obviously you could, for years and years I used to airbrush everything, and it works perfectly, but it takes a really, really long time, and you have to be careful. And if you go out of the line or whatever, you can, So I'm all about trying to find nice, quick ways of doing things, and Gaussian blur is one of the tools I use the most, along with color fill. And clipping masks I use quite a lot, and alpha locking. Alpha locking a layer means it only, when you draw above anything that's alpha locked, it'll only draw on what's there, and it won't go at the edges. Again, another tip to make things quick. Here I'm adding something that doesn't really exist in the photo. I put a few little ripples so it looks more reflective if you have a couple of ripples. I just know that because I've done it before a bunch of times, and it just makes it look a bit more like glass or the water's moving or something. When it's too still, it can look a bit stiff. You'll notice in the photo reference there's actually quite a lot of texture on the water. I was thinking about doing that, but I left it in the end. But you could put a texture over it rather than try and draw it. Okay, that's about it. A few little clouds there, just a bit of white, and then smudge them. That's all you really need to do. I think this turned out pretty decent. I don't do reflections very often. But if you like it, give me a sub and like, and I'll see you in the next one.